agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson.
Hey, good morning, Mike.
Hey, Jay, how you doing this morning?
I am as in charge as Joe Biden driving an 18-wheeler.
Oh, geez, that's okay. I'll go with that.
I don't know whether you followed that story at all.
No, I
see, mainstream media doesn't report it, but
yeah, well,
it's fun. Look it up.
I definitely will. Okay. Well, hey, before we get going today, just a quick announcement. Sometime soon, we're going to be rolling out a new logo for the podcast. It will still be the Politics Guys, but in place of the caricatures of Trey and myself and Kristen, you'll see a map of the United States with the states in red or blue, kind of reflective, of the 2020 presidential vote. And also, I think, generally speaking, the underlying partisan divisions in the country. And the reason for this, a couple things. Number one, Trey's connection to the Republican Party isn't nearly as strong as it used to be. And so seeing him in that big red,
don't say,
yeah, Republican LFA, he didn't leave the party left him. I know the feeling, Trey. But anyway, that doesn't seem quite right anymore. And Kristen's on kind of an indefinite hiatus from the podcast. And and obviously the caricature cover left out, you, Jay, and Ken, and that was nothing personal. That was just we tried to fit in more, and it didn't quite work visually. So we're going with this. Actually, I should mention on our Discord.
I've often been told I don't quite work visually.
Yeah, I hear that myself too. But I just a couple days ago, or yesterday on our Discord, a listener, BB, posted a thing with our four faces, myself, Trey, you, and Ken on Mount Rushmore. And it was a beautiful, stirring sort of thing. So, yeah, if you haven't checked out the Discord, it's worth it for that alone. I really loved that, actually. And he was kind enough not to put me in Jefferson's place, so I was grateful for that. Anyway, so today we are going to be talking about the government shutdown that was averted, oral arguments in the Mississippi abortion case, the NLRB calling for a new unionization vote for an Amazon plant, a whole bunch of stuff about redistricting. We'll get into how privileged exactly I am. It's kind of a continuation from a conversation we just started the week before, and some other stuff as well. But before we get to that, we will just take a quick break and we will come back and get started. Okay, so on Thursday, Congress averted a government shutdown by approving a continuing resolution that will fund government operations until February 18th, as well as providing $7 billion for resettlement of Afghan refugees. The vote in the House was 221 to 212, with only one Republican, or I guess Rhino, Adam Kinzinger, voting with House Democrats to approve the measure. Now, in the Senate, there was actually some real bipartisanship. The vote was 69 to 28, with 19 Republicans joining all 50 Democrats in approving the measure. And Senate approval came after the Senate voted down an amendment that would defund federal vaccine mandates. And, while most, if not all, of the Senate Republican caucus opposes those mandates, I think Minority Leader McConnell expressed the view of the Senate Republicans voting for the CR, saying that a shutdown would only create chaos and uncertainty. So I don't think that's the best vehicle to get this job done. And next up, we have the debt ceiling limit, which Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says should be reached around December 15th. So, Jay, I wanted to get your thoughts on this, if you thought there were any surprises here, and also if you expect a, relatively speaking, similarly easy resolution on the debt ceiling vote.
So, no, I would say no surprises on this. The CR has become sort of the way we govern, right? These used to be sort of these apocalyptic sort of cliffs that we're going to fall off, but it's just that's kind of we tend to kick the can down the road. So no big surprises, and I think Republicans rightfully do the math, and government shutdowns do not favor Republicans politically, regardless of where you are in the substance of them, and saying chaos ensues and so forth. But I'm not surprised by that. On the debt ceiling, I would hope for more pushback on this. I anticipate that there will be an agreement on the debt ceiling. We're not going to default. But I would expect and I would hope that McConnell would maybe take a little tougher line on this time than he did last time, for all the reasons I said last time, right? This is and I guess it depends on where the numbers are and who has the votes where. But, last time the Democrats didn't really have the votes, and the Republicans bailed them out. So I think that'll happen again, but I'd like to be able to get something for it, or at least, again, and I'm not talking, big policy stuff, but more just sort of some credit where credit is due, or playing the game, if you will.
So
you can say that's kind of shallow of me, but I think it's sure, just being realistic.
I'll say it's shallow of you, but but so it sounds like you're saying that you're pretty much, well, I wonder if you're not necessarily saying that you're okay with the politics of hostage taking, as it's been called, and you don't necessarily. This is my charitable interpretation. You're not necessarily saying that you think it's a good thing to basically dangle the possibility of a government default over it. But if it's going to be dangled, and if that's the political reality, then Republicans should milk it for all it's worth.
I'm saying that if the party in power needs a big favor to avert a political disaster, they ought to ask nicely. And sort of like when you show up for somebody at somebody's house for the holidays, it's nice to bring a gift, even just a small token.
So what's the favor exactly? We're saying, would you please make sure that the United States doesn't default on its debt? That's a favor? I would think that that's sort of a baseline responsibility of members of both parties.
Yes, it is a favor. If you have the nominal majority in both houses and you have the presidency, then yes, it is, because the party in power is supposed to govern. So
it sounds like you're saying, I mean, to me, the analogy would be like, well, if, you have two people careening down and going ready to go off a cliff, and both of them need to step on a brake to stop it, then you're saying one person needs to turn to the other and say, hey, would you mind, please, stepping on your brake as well, so we don't go off the cliff? I find that.
I think the analogy is pretty close to that, but it's sort of the one guy's driving, right? The one person has is in charge of the car nominally. And they're asking the passenger to pull the emergency brake, if you will.
So they both don't go off the cliff and die. Yeah. So would you please do that? I would so appreciate it if you would do that.
Well, I think they also go off the cliff and die. I think that might be.
Go off the cliff and are horribly injured.
Like in all my experience, there is, if you're going to govern, you need to be able to have the votes. And if you've got a majority, but you can't pull together your majority for something like this, that says something.
Yeah, and actually, they do have a majority on this, and Mitch McConnell has sort of at least hinted that while he certainly won't work to help provide the Democrats with any Republican votes, he suggested that he might try to convince his caucus not to filibuster a debt ceiling suspension. And so I think that's
I think that would be silly.
Mighty big of him,
I think that would be very silly.
Yeah, and so in that sense,
I'm not suggesting that they ought to do something like that, or that there ought to be you ought to whip the vote against it.
Yeah.
But I like I said, I felt sort of, let's say, just let down by the last debt ceiling vote, and then also the infrastructure vote, where you had Republicans in the House who had to bail out Nancy Pelosi because she didn't have the votes. So again, I'm not expecting anything big, but I would expect just a little bit more of a dust up, a little bit more of pushback. a little bit more of just a, because look, you can say this is juvenile, you can say it's shallow, but this is the game as it's played, right? It's a little bit like, in football, and all these people are highly paid, greatest athletes in the world, but there's always those like little moments where like they're the play's dead, and they sort of like try to get the spot just like a little bit better, just a couple inches over from what it was. You know what I mean? That sort of thing.
Yeah, and I guess
that's part of the game.
I get
right?
what you're saying, and I get what you're saying, and that's certainly the reality. But what I think is so disheartening to me and to a lot of Americans is the fact that that's how it's seen in its entirety by so many people as simply a game. And the fact of the matter is there are very real stakes. It's not like football or soccer or something like that. This is serious business with major ramifications, life or death in many cases, ramifications. And I think a lot of folks find it disgusting that it's so entirely treated as a game of we win, you lose, sort of zero sum sort of thing. I find that personally disgusting, and the fact that so many people just that's just the game. Oh well, that just turns my stomach.
Oh well, I'm saying when you have government that is close to 50-50 divided, is 50-50 in the Senate, there's something to be said about being sort of a little bit of respectful to the other folks whose help you may need. And I think that's what I'm trying to say is,
gotcha.
There's so often if you just say, oh, okay, we'll let you do whatever, and it's not on you, governing party, or 50 plus one tiebreaker. You're sort of abdicating what you owe to your constituents as well, right? If you want to have a government that compromise and in these kind of cases, right? I think you should, but you've got a situation where one side has a very slim majority, and is sort of not saying, hey, we'd like to work across the aisle in a bipartisan fashion to make sure that we don't default, and therefore we'll recognize some of your concerns, or at least thank you for your efforts. In doing so.
Yeah. Thank you for not plunging the country into chaos. Right? We really appreciate it.
In doing so.
Very big of you.
As opposed to we demand that you vote with us and save our skin.
Yeah,
look,
there are no demands being made.
It would be disastrous for everyone.
Yeah.
But it would be more disastrous for Democrats.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I understand this is just your sort of Machiavellian, political, cynical kind of gamesmanship sort of analysis of it. And I get that.
People tune into us to hear what's real, right?
And
that's what I try to bring.
Well, yeah, and you definitely bring that, I think. But I also think people tune in to hear what's right. And certainly that's what I think I like to think that I bring is I can talk about. I like to think that I talk about what's real, but I think also that it's important to pull back from that cynical sort of politics is a game sort of thing and say, wait a second, what's the right thing to do here? Because to the extent that we forget about that and we make politics just simply a game with ugly or less athletic players, well, then, we debase and devalue our democracy and turn it into a joke. And I'm not okay with that. And I don't think anyone should.
So this is where one of these, you and I have kind of just fundamentally different visions about, I guess, our role and what we can do.
Absolutely.
I see myself more as I am an observer and a commentator, like somebody watching, like a commentator on a football game saying, look, here's what's going on. Rather than saying, wow, I wish they wouldn't try to get away with that, the sneaky kind of holds, you know what I mean? And sometimes the ref doesn't see them, but I try to point out what is actually going on as someone who has played the game to some extent. What's going on in the trenches, and what to expect from that.
And I think there's absolutely value to that, but I think that without the sort of broader look at, well, how should the rules be and how can the game be better, that sort of more idealistic look, then it becomes just a sterile exercise in cynicism. And just like I think that the idealism without the realism becomes this kind of divorced from reality thing. And so that's why I think it's important to consider both sides of these things. And so I certainly don't think that, I won't put words into your mouth. I don't imagine that you just think that political idealism of any sort is pointless and worthless.
No, certainly not.
Okay. I just wanted to be clear on that.
If you're asking me what I think is going to happen in the Senate in the next couple weeks.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm telling you.
Yeah, and I get that. On that kind of same level, I guess in a way, one thing I wanted to point out, or one thing I've noted about this vote and some other votes is Ben Sasse, who there was a point there, especially after January 6th, Ben Sasse seemed to be like sort of a Republican I could almost see myself supporting in some instances, and yet Sasse voted against this. He's voted against. In fact, he's one of the more actually anti, if you measure voting with or against, President Biden, if you look at the team sort of thing, one of the more anti-Biden Republicans in the Senate. And it seems to me to be so at odds with sort of the message he's crafting. And I guess, it's part of the whole Ben Sasse wants to be the next president, I would expect, and kind of carving out a lane for himself. But it's the part of politics that I get. And, you talk about this, obviously, but it just bums me out, I guess. I've always been more of an idealist than you, though, and I guess that's why this stuff affects me a lot more,
Yeah, I think maybe, and maybe it's because, we should organize a field trip for you, right? We'll go down to the state legislature and see if we can, you can sit in on some caucus meetings and committee meetings and just sort of, because my
it sounds like you're saying I'm naive, and I reject that. I reject that.
Okay.
I'm not naive at all, Jay. I know how the sausage is made, but what I am saying is that I can understand the process. I can be a realist, but then I can also look back and say, you know what, this is not how things should be, and we should try to make things better, as opposed to just simply cynically saying, well, that's the game. How much can we wring out of this? How many victories can we get? And, screw the results to the American public. What matters is if my team wins. And I just call bullshit on that.
So let me paint it this way for you.
Sure.
All right. If you are a Republican senator from a whatever state, a purplish state.
Sure.
And you're looking at this as saying, hey, this debt ceiling piece, a lot of my folks are not going to like it, because they're going to say, by doing this, by not holding firm on the debt ceiling, you are essentially allowing the Democrats to rack up more debt. The whole point of putting in this debt ceiling process, which you can say it's a good process or a bad process, was to provide this check on runaway financial, financial spending. That's a bad phrase, but on runaway expenditures, right? That there would have to be this check at some point where you open the credit card bill and say, "Geez, that's how much I've run up," right? And it can be and should be sobering. So I think if you're a Republican senator, you say, look, this is the reason this is in here, is for us to stop and say, wait a minute, guys, is this the road we want to take? Simply saying we're going to agree to increase our credit card limit, or as maybe is more function, or maybe more accurate, as the Democrats like to phrase it, well, we're just refinancing our current debt. We're going to expand our terms as far as being able to pay off what we've already borrowed.
But that's not what the debt ceiling is fundamentally about. The debt ceiling is fundamentally about saying we're going to honor our obligations.
Right.
We've already incurred this debt, and so we will honor those. We will not default on our obligations. That sounds like a very kind of bedrock conservative personal responsibility. You pay your bills.
Yeah, but again, is it? I guess is it bedrock conservatism if the reason you're in that position is you keep borrowing more and more and more and more and more.
That's a reasonable conversation to have.
Yeah, on that sort of borrowing. So I think you would be remiss if you don't stand up and say, instead of just approving this and saying, yep, let's keep doing it. And next month we'll spend more. In fact, next month we'll spend $3 trillion.
Well, yeah, and I think, yeah,
I mean, I don't think it's unreasonable or unidealistic to say this is government spending is a big problem in the Republican view. In my view, it may be the biggest problem we face, and to simply roll over and not make a fuss when asked to by the other party, which nominally has a majority. I think
sure. I see what you're saying. Yeah,
malpractice.
Yeah, that's reasonable. I think certainly that that Republicans who believe that you do, and pretty much all Republicans, I think most Republicans believe what you do about government spending, that, yeah, in casting their vote, they should make it clear that they have a big problem with increasing levels of debt. So, yeah, absolutely. I certainly don't think that that's the duty of the minority party to acquiesce without a peep.
And following from that, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I just do want to hit this because I think I've found a way to phrase it correctly, is that the Democrats, the governing party, in seeking that, it's not too much to ask the minority party. The minority party asked the governing party to say, "Hey, look, we will agree to pay off our current debts now, but we have grave concerns about taking on another $3 trillion in spending. Perhaps you should reconsider that."
And that's a separate vote and a separate conversation.
And I'm not. And again, like I said, everybody knows at the end of the day that debt ceiling is going to get expanded. But I think that's important from an idealistic perspective, right? If you're representing the people who sent you and representing what I think is a pretty valid view of what the government does and ought to be doing, I think it's perfectly fair and correct to say, hey, before I bail you out.
Sure, absolutely. We agree on that. Yeah, definitely. So what started off as what I thought was going to be a pretty short segment on a semi-routine extension of the government funding actually turned into more of kind of an idealism versus realism sort of theory. Go figure. We never know what's going to happen here. It's very. But anyway. Why don't we move on to talk about I think the story that a lot of folks are really focused on more than anything else this week, the oral arguments in the Mississippi abortion law case before the Supreme Court this week. But before we do that, we'll just take a quick break and be right back with that. On Wednesday, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, which involves the constitutionality of Mississippi's 2018 enacted abortion law that prohibits all abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy, with no exception for rape or incest, and only highly limited exceptions being for medical emergencies or for severe fetal abnormality. Now, based on what the justices had to say in Wednesday's oral argument, it seems nearly certain that they'll be making significant changes to the constitutional status of abortion laws. And there appear to be, I would say, 6 votes to uphold the Mississippi law, which flatly contradicts the previous standard that prohibits abortion bans prior to viability, which is generally viewed to be around 24 weeks. It also seems to me that there are likely 5 votes to overturn the central holding in Roe versus Wade, and that is that there exists a constitutional right for a woman to end her pregnancy, and that the state's interest, namely the interest in the potential life, but also the protecting the mother's health, that those don't outweigh the woman's privacy and personal liberty interest until later in the pregnancy. Now, in Roe, that was initially that trimester framework, but that was modified to the pre-post viability standard in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. So I think, Jay, that we can sort of break this issue down into a few component parts because there's a lot going on here. And first, I think is the politics of the thing. How the court's likely to rule, what the ramifications of that ruling might be. And that, to me, it seems like that's where the vast majority of the coverage in the media is focused on. And I thought, well, we could kind of start with that. So starting with that, would you agree, I guess, initially with my assessment about what the court is likely to do and where, you see the votes kind of falling out on this?
Probably. I would agree. I think that the Mississippi law is likely to get upheld. I'm less certain on how they get there and whether that entails a wholesale overruling of Roe and Casey, or something in between. The sense is very much that, and again, you don't have to be some sort of really seasoned Supreme Court watcher to look at this, is that Roberts, would rather have some sort of compromise that would not entail the wholesale overruling, or it would be some sort of incremental overruling. I'm not sure how exactly you get there, but these are a whole lot of really smart people thinking about this. So there may be a way to do it.
But you would agree
that's my initial, yeah.
You would agree that essentially there's basically no way that 24-week standard that viability standard that was set in Casey that goes away, or at least it's modified down to
or at least one way to do it, and this would be sort of one could argue, well, Casey didn't really draw that sort of a black line. And this does not present an undue burden, even though it is pre-viability. Now, that would be kind of a sort of overruling, undermining of Casey, right? Because in Casey, there's sort of a presumption that anything pre-viability would be an undue burden. That's one route that the court might take, right? And it's not, again, that's the more political route. I don't know that it's intellectually defensible entirely. Right?
But the bottom line is that come June, when the court rules on this, they're going to issue a ruling that will make it possible for a bunch of states to put restrictions on a woman's right to terminate a pregnancy that would not have been possible prior to that ruling.
I think that's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, as I think everyone pretty much assumed, that it's just a question of how broad those restrictions will be allowed to be. But so that's going to be almost certainly the part of the ruling. So then the question is, well, what will the political fallout for that be? A lot of folks think, well, this is going to, because this is going to come out, of course, in early summer, and that's right before the midterm election season kind of gets heated up. And there are some people, I think, on the left who are thinking, maybe wishfully thinking, that, well, this, at least, given that the inevitability of this ruling, at the very least, this should galvanize Democratic constituencies and perhaps minimize or even minimize to a certain extent the possibility of major Democratic midterm losses in the House and Senate. Well, what do you think about that in terms of political ramifications?
Maybe it fires up the base some, but my sense is that part of the base is already fired up.
Yeah.
Right. That's not the problem that Democrats have coming into the midterms. Isn't that it's not getting its pro-choice people to the polls. The problem is it's not appealing to moderates and independents.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. Yeah. Does it bump the enthusiasm a little bit? Sure. But I don't think it fundamentally changes the numbers, right? I still think, as James Carville famously said, it's the economy, stupid, right? And for most voters, this is a secondary issue, and for those voters that this is a primary issue, they are where they are, and they're not changing. And you could also get, I mean, sort of an offsetting bump for pro-life Republicans.
Well,
who might say, finally, we're getting somewhere.
Yeah, I don't know about that, because generally speaking, when you're satisfied with how things are going, you're less likely to get worked up. And I think what people look back and they say, well, the initial ruling, Roe versus Wade, sort of galvanized, created this sort of pro-life political movement, but that was a very different political era, and I think we're already so broken up into these warring camps that I agree with you that there might be a slight surge in terms of Democrat support, but I don't think it's going to be enough to make a significant difference. Certainly not enough to, I think, allow the Democrats to hold the House or maybe even in the Senate. So yeah, I tend to agree with you on the politics of this sort of thing.
The more important piece of this to me, and quite honestly, I've always thought this is the more important piece, is, look, this should make a bigger difference, and it should make a bigger difference in state races, right? I mean, this would allow. I mean, if there's a complete overrule, this allows people running for the state legislature to campaign saying, "Here's what I do. Here's what I want our state's abortion policy to be," and voters come out and support me or don't, and in a lot of ways, I think that's the healthier impulse, right? That's the healthier way to get this sorted out. As you've pointed out, there are a number of states that have trigger laws, one way or the other. Some triggering that abortion will become, prohibited upon the overruling of Roe versus Wade. Others indicating that if Roe versus Wade is overruled, then the state will automatically adopt a "hey, abortion's for everybody all the time" rule. And from a federalist standpoint, from a constitutional standpoint, I think that's probably the right result. And there's going to be some turmoil there, but I think that's fundamentally what overturning Roe versus Wade would mean and has always meant.
But
right?
it
goes back to the states.
Yes and no, because it's certainly possible for Congress to pass a law. In fact, the House has, I think, repeatedly passed a measure that would essentially put the standard mentioned or decided on in Casey, basically enshrine that into law and
a federal civil right, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's gotten through the House a number of times. There've never been the votes in the Senate, and there aren't now. And certainly you could see that making that more of a live issue. But again, I just don't see it.
And I think I'd say there's a constitutional question on that as well, I think. But that's for another day.
Now, and the argument on that is that certainly the differing abortion standards in differing states, that absolutely implicates interstate commerce, and so therefore under its commerce
I would
clause,
say conception is a purely intrastate activity.
Well, provision of abortion services, though, especially when people are crossing state lines to get them, that actually is interstate. So you're
right. No, I get it, but I'm just saying there's a question there. There would definitely be a challenge to
Oh gosh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I'm
Not that that's going to happen unless something totally bizarre happens. Because I don't even know that, there are barely the votes in the House to get that passed. But in the Senate, there's just no way that happens. And it's not like Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema are going to say, hey, you know what, let's abolish the filibuster so we can pass abortion rights legislation. That's some other world, basically, unfortunately. So yeah. But, so it seems like we agree largely on the politics, but it seems to me that there are also the more fundamental issues of what the Constitution actually says here and how the court should interpret it. And what I noticed in the coverage this week is that that's actually gotten a lot or very little coverage, actually. It seems to me like everyone has their preferred side. And so, for instance, if you think that women should have the right to terminate a pregnancy, you just assume the Constitution supports your preferred policy outcome. And the same way, if you're on the opposite side of thing, and that without actually, going back to the Constitution and looking at it and thinking about it. And we've talked about this before, Jay, this idea that, well, we're just going to start from our preferred policy outcome and read whatever we want and into the Constitution. That drives me just absolutely.
If there's something I like, it must be in the Constitution.
Because all constitutional means is that something I really like. And if it's unconstitutional, it just means something I really don't like. And that's just, well, anyway, that's one of my particular hobby horses. And so I wanted to move on to that next, but I think that's kind of where we'll end our preview, our free ad-supported preview show, and then kind of start off our full listener-supported Patreon show with that. So if you are not yet...
Find out what happens.
Yeah, exactly. Find out what happens. We're going to be talking about that and that Amazon unionization vote and redistricting, gerrymandering, and my privilege, or if I have privilege or not. Anyway, whole bunch of stuff. So if you want to check that out, it's patreon.com/politicsguys. Sign up, become a supporter to get the full length, no ads episode every single week. And again, as always, if you're not in a position to be able to financially support the show, we're happy to provide that to you for free. Just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and we will get you all set up with that. Also, I should mention that if, for whatever reason, you're not a big fan of Patreon, you can also support us on PayPal as well as on Venmo, where we're at Politics Guys. You can always find support links in our show notes and at politicsguys.com/support.